morning. It is Thursday, May 11th, and we will be looking today, this morning, at the fourth sign and the fifth sign, the feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus walking on water. Just a quick note about yesterday, didn't do a gaming session. Just a lot going on, so wasn't able to make it. Apologize for that. Feeling a little under the weather. I'm not sure if I'm sick or not, but hopefully I'll be able to do it. We'll be able to do it this evening. So, uh, with that said, let's look at today's passage. We're in John chapter 6. Actually, we're going to look at John chapter 5. At the end of chapter 5, there's some important content here leading up to the miracle that John records for us, the two miracles that are back to back, are recorded for us in John chapter 6. So we'll start in John chapter 5, verse 36. This is Jesus speaking. If you remember the context, he just performed the last miracle where he healed the guy who was lame, and then he starts talking with the Judean elite in Jerusalem. They're having this back and forth about the Sabbath, about honoring the Son or honoring the Father and the Son and everything else that's going on there. And so he says in verse 36, he's kind of concluding his argument with them. He says, "But I have a greater testimony uh, than that from John." He's comparing himself to John's ministry. And he says, "The works of the Father has given me to finish. The very works I'm doing testify about me that the Father has sent me." Right? And right there, purpose statement. What is John doing to show that Jesus is the Son of God and that he's the King of Israel? And here Jesus is saying, that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. Their testimony about why I've been sent. Verse 37, "And the Father who sent me has testified concerning me, and you have never heard his voice nor seen his form, nor do you have his word living in you, because you do not trust the one he sent." Okay? It says, "You search the scriptures because you suppose that in them you have eternal life. It is these that testify about me, yet you are unwilling to come to me so that you may have life. I do not accept glory from men, but I know you, that you do not have the love of God in yourselves. I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. But if another comes in his own name, you will receive him. How can you believe when you receive glory from another and do not seek the glory that comes from God alone? Do not think that I will accuse you before the Father. The one who accuses you is Moses, in whom you have put your hope. For if you were believing Moses, you would believe in me, because he wrote because he wrote about me. But since you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" Now it's here where I want to turn over to Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy chapter 17 reads, "They have done well in what they have spoken. I will raise up a prophet like you for them from among their brothers. I will put my words in his mouth, and he will speak to them all that I command him. Now, whoever does not listen to my words that this prophet speaks in my name, I myself will call him to account. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet will die." So I probably didn't have to read verse 20. But notice here, in this discussion that Jesus is having with these Judean elite, he's referring to Moses, and he's referring to this idea that you know he speaks what the Father has spoken, and that falls in line with what God is writing here through Moses. Moses is recording these events in the book of Deuteronomy, and he speaks to the fact, and he's recording what God himself said, that he would raise a prophet and that he would put his words in his mouth. So Jesus is making a direct connection between himself and this prophet that was prophesied about or that was promised, I should say, not prophesied about, but promised by God in Deuteronomy chapter 18. And it's important to note here, for the context of the audience, why why John, I should say, is using this language, and why Jesus might be using this language and speaking to the Judean elite. And also knowing, and then John recording this information and putting it into his gospel, knowing he's speaking or primarily to Galilean Jews, or even Samaritan Jewish people. And that's because the Galilean Jewish people and the Samaritan Jewish people in general only accepted the book of Moses as scripture, as Torah. Okay. And this is even an argument between the Sadducees and Pharisees. The Sadducees felt the same way. The Pharisees believed that, the Psalms and Proverbs and pretty much what we read in our Old Testament, along with some other things that have been left out, they believed in all that stuff to be scripture inspired by God, stuff that we should be reading and studying. Okay. The Sadducees and a lot of other Jewish people throughout Israel only accepted the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, as scripture. Okay. This is a really interesting concept. And John knowing this, and Jesus knowing this too, used specifically the book of Deuteronomy to refer to himself, not as so much the Davidic Messiah, king, whatever, but more because if you notice, some of that stuff is later on: First Samuel, Second Kings, all that stuff, Chronicles, and in all the other prophets. He instead refers to himself as the prophet, the one who was promised by God to come and to speak on behalf of God, to have God's words in his mouth. Okay. And that's why at the end of the passage of John chapter 5, that's why he says, you search the scriptures because you suppose you have life in me. It is these that testify about me. So he's referring to himself. He's like, this is in the scriptures. This is there for you to listen. Yet you're willing to come to me, right? And then you notice at the end here, he says, do not think that I will accuse you, Father, but the one who accuses you is Moses. And he's referring to the scriptures that are contributed to Moses. It's like, you're going to be found guilty by the very scriptures that you say that you're following, because the scriptures speak about me, and now you won't believe. It just says in verse 46, if you were believing Moses, you believe me because he wrote about me. Right? So it's Deuteronomy chapter 18. Now, as the narrative progresses, right, it says afterwards Yeshua went away to the other side of Sea Galilee. So that all of that happened in Jerusalem, right, around this area where this man had been healed by this Asclepion there, somewhere around the temple. Now Jesus is back into the northern part of Israel, back to the area of Galilee, back to the Sea of Galilee. And there, John again is speaking about the difference in the crowds and the difference in the reception, right, between the Judean believers and the elite and what was going on in Galilee. So he says in verse 2, a large crowd was following him because they were watching the signs he was performing on the sick. So John acknowledges there were other signs and other things that are going on. In fact, at the end of his gospel, he says, there's so many things that could be written about, but there'd be volumes and volumes of books. But this is my purpose, this is my goal, so I'm sticking to this. And it says that Jesus, after he was done performing a sick, he went and sat down on the mountainside. Now, I want you to try to picture this setting. Okay, John is very intentional about the setting and about what's going to happen here, because he's comparing Jesus now to Moses. Okay, there's a reference to Moses. There's a reference to the fact that Jesus is saying that he is testified about by Moses, and that he is a prophet raised up just like Moses, and that God is speaking through him just like Moses, but at the same time, he's better than Moses, right? And how is he better than Moses? Okay, if we look in verse 4, it says the Passover, the Jewish feast, was near, which is again another reference to the time of Moses. and and the fact that Moses, the whole thing, Passover, everything was their salvation, their time. That's like the seminal moment of their existence. He says, lifting up his eyes and seeing a large crowd coming to him, Yeshua said to Philip, "Where will we buy bread so that these may eat?" Now Yeshua was saying this to test him, for he knew what he was about to do. And Philip answered him, 200 denarii is enough to buy bread for each to get a little bit. And one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what's that for so many?" Yeshua said, "Make the people recline." It means let them relax, let them sit down, enjoy themselves, lean on each other. Now notice this detail here. There was so much grass in the area. So the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. And a lot of commentators mention how back then they would only pretty much count the men and as an indication of numbers. And so there could be obviously so many more people. There was a boy mentioned. He's not a man, so just children, women. It could be double that number, triple. If it's like a husband, a wife, and a kid, and it could be like 15,000 people. We don't know, but we know it's more than 5,000. And then it says in verse 11, Yeshua picked up the loaves, and having given thanks, he distributed bread to everyone who was reclining. He did the same with the fish, as much as they wanted. The people were full. Yeshua said to his disciples, "Gather up the leftovers so nothing is wasted." So they gathered them and filled the 12 baskets with broken pieces from 5 barley loaves, which were left over by those who had finished eating. When the people saw the sign that Yeshua performed, they began to say, "This is most certainly the prophet who has come into the world." Realizing that they were about to come and seize him by force to make him king, Yeshua withdrew again to the mountain, himself alone. Now, again, don't miss out here on the imagery. Okay, think about your Old Testament story and the idea that this starts with Passover. Okay, feast is coming. What happened when the Jewish people experienced Passover? They were finally allowed to leave Egypt. When they left Egypt, they crossed the Red Sea. They went into the desert. As they went into the desert, now they needed food. Remember, after receiving the Torah and Ten Commandments, everything, they needed food, and so God blessed them with manna, right, bread from heaven. If you remember that story, the manna was limited as to how much they could have. Right, they could only gather what they could in the morning. They eat it the next day. They had to throw away anything left over, and the next morning they had to go and go out and get the manna themselves again, right? Which is like this wafer thin type of bread came from heaven. And those who tried to keep the bread, like, oh, let me grab a couple extra and just keep it, just because in the morning it was full of worms, and so they had to learn, like they couldn't overindulge, they couldn't over prepare. They just had to get what they could for that day, and that was it. And here, um, in contrast to that, I think I lost my video. Excuse me a second. I lost my video here, and it's not turning back on for me. Difficult. It's on. It's on. It's just for some reason not connected. Give me a second, please. Bear with me. These technical difficulties. Switch USB ports here. I'm like, okay, power up again. Yeah. So just waiting to see if this cam link will turn back on, if the camera will turn back on or not. I'm wondering if the camera somehow ran out of battery. On. Here we go. Um, I'm on a different camera now. I'm on the FaceTime camera here with the here we go. There we go. All right, back on. Not sure what happened there. Apologize for that. Apologize for that delay. So what I was saying was, they had to. I'm trying to remember now. They had to get the bread every day, and you juxtapose that to what John is telling us here about Jesus. Uh, he provides for them bread and fish too, right? It's not just bread. If you know the story, maybe you don't. At some point, they get sick of the manna, and they're like, "Oh, we don't want this manna anymore. We don't want this bread anymore." Uh, and so God gave them quail, but there was a lot of complaining. This is about the food. But here Jesus gives them exactly something that they want, they need. Also, notice the setting. John went out of his way to point out that there was plenty of grass. When the people of Israel were wandering in that desert and they were relying on manna and everything else, they were literally in a desert. And so the image there is like it's sandy, it's dusty, wherever the grass was, and they had dew and they got the manna was not very, like, it wasn't as lush. I think they what John is trying to show us here, show his reader, is that as opposed to Moses, dry in the desert, manna that it would expire, that wouldn't go, that would get bad, go bad, and stuff like that. Here you have Jesus, a prophet who has come, has shown all these signs, and now he's giving you bread, and the bread that he's giving you is in abundance. And if you notice, there were 12 baskets left over, and Eli Lazorkin Eisenberg, to give him credit for this one, he mentions uh, the 12 tribes of Israel, and he feels like it's a very purposeful statement by John to point out how many baskets were left, because he was trying to tell the reader, like, there's plenty of bread, there's plenty for all the tribes, right? If you remember, his gospel is pointed towards all the tribes. He's not trying to just appeal to Judean uh, believers or Jewish people. Like the Gospel of Matthew. The Gospel of Matthew is really tailored towards those who need to read about Jesus and know how does he fulfill the Davidic uh, promise of a Messiah, the promise of a Davidic Messiah, right? Um, the son of David, and so it's really big into that concept. And so that's the Gospel of Matthew. But now in the Gospel of John, we have this approach where he wants to include all of Israel into his narrative, and he includes the 12 baskets because it's for everybody. And their response in verse 14 is a direct connection to Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18, that I will raise up a prophet for you. And that prophet is and that's why they say here, this is the most certainly the prophet. Okay, it's something, again, these people focused on the Torah. They didn't really accept all the other parts of the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament of Scripture. They only believed in the Torah as being the Tanakh, the five, or sorry, the first five books, the Pentateuch. And so they only trusted in that, and that's the one prophecy that they looked forward to, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18. And so when they see that he's feeding them this bread, and it's in abundance, and there's so much left over, and there's enough for everybody in Israel, not just the ones in the south, not just for that group there that's been looking for Son of David to return, uh, then they're like, wow, this guy really is our king. He's our king. Remember the point of the twofold point of John's narrative, to prove that Jesus is the Son of God and that he's the King of Israel, right? And so this miracle focuses more on that aspect, that he is the King of Israel. Now we're going to move forward into the next miracle here, this next sign number 5. Now, when evening came, Yeshua's disciples went down the sea. Getting into a boat, they set out to cross the sea towards Capernaum. By now it had become dark, and still Yeshua had not come to them. A great wind began to blow, stirring up the sea. After they rowed about 25 or 30 stadia, they catch sight of Yeshua walking on the sea, approaching the boat. They were terrified, but Yeshua said to them, I am, don't be afraid. When they wanted to take him into the boat, then they wanted to take him into the boat, and right away the boat reached the shore where they were headed. Now, there's a lot of stuff here uh, that's pointing to now Jesus is the Son of God. Uh, if you remember, also in the Passover story, kind of mentioned it briefly, but Moses walks the people through the Red Sea, right? And as they're walking through the Red Sea, you can imagine, there's walls of water on either side of them. There's like fish that are probably just like swimming up to them, like, hey, how do I get through here? Like, what's going on? There's a rocky bed, and there's maybe some moss growing or whatever. Maybe some of them are seeing fish flopping around the ground. And they're like, wow, this is crazy. And maybe some of them ate some of the fish, and that's why there was fish as part of the miracle. I don't know. Uh, but they walked through this sea, right? They had to walk through it. They needed God to open it up and walk through it. And then it closed behind them. And they also had to walk through a river, the Jordan River, when they came into the Promised Land. Here, Jesus doesn't need to be so dramatic. He doesn't need the Father to open up the waters for him to walk through it. Right? That's what happened in the Old Testament. That's what happened in those old stories. God was the one who's opening up the water, and Moses holding up the stick, and they were able to walk through, and so on and so forth. But here, as the Son of God, he could just directly walk on top of the water. Okay. And water, as Eli Lazorkin Eisenberg says, and others have also agreed, water in the Jewish idea, especially in this time, in the Jewish culture, and just in their mindset, water was the most destructive force of nature, right? And I don't know if that has to do with how it destroyed the Egyptian army. It might, have to do with the fact that it just totally destroyed the Egyptian army. When the water closed back on them. But water since then had been viewed as the most destructive, powerful force in nature. And here you have Jesus not only just walking on it because he doesn't need the Father to open it, but he's also just dominating it, because no matter what's going on, there's this storm going on, and the sea is being turned upside down, and it's all crazy, and the disciples are scared. Which Eisenberg, he tells a story about someone he knew that got caught up in the same storm, like in today's time. Got caught up the same way, and the Israeli rescue force had to come and get him and airlift him out of there. And so the same thing still happens because of how it's situated in the water and the mountains, the water, and just the way the wind blows down, the storms and everything else. And he's just dominating that. He's just walking over it. And so for the reader, they're reading this and they're like, wow. Not only is he the prophet, not only is he the one that was prophesied about, or that was promised to us, I say in Deuteronomy chapter 18, and he's done a better job than Moses. He's fed them with so much bread they're full. He has enough bread for all the 12 tribes. He rested them in a beautiful, in nice grassy area, and not in the sandy desert with dry heat or whatever. They're all comfortable. Now I'm reading this narrative. It's like, hey, he did that. Wow, he may be the one. Deuteronomy chapter 18. Then you keep reading. It's like, well, not only did he do that, but he's also walking on the water, and there's a storm, and he's dominating that. Yeah, this guy might be the Son of God. And I don't want you to miss this either. There's a reason why John tells us about how far they had rowed out into the water. Not to tell us how much Jesus had to walk, but to give us this like supernatural thing that happens, and it's just kind of like it's so quickly stated. I feel like a lot of people can just skip it. But he says after they wrote it, I read stadia in this translation, but in my CSB it says in verse 19 they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles. That wasn't the whole length of the lake. Eisenberg had mentioned how long this thing was. It's probably about the width of 8 miles, and it was 14 miles long from north to south. And so the entire lake was 64 square miles. So either way, like in the direction they were going, they had a few miles left. And if you notice in verse 20, that after they had rowed about that, they saw Jesus, they're afraid, he calms them down, then they brought him into the boat, and right away the boat reached the shore where they were headed. So John's speaking really to another miracle. Like the fifth sign is a combination of walking on water, dominating the storm and darkness that had been there, uh, and then this like fast forward miraculous teleportation from the moment he gets on to the boat to the next to where they were going. Okay, all of this is intended. These two signs sandwiched together or placed together, should say placed together, for the narrative continue in John's mind about the fact that Jesus is not only the King of Israel, he provides bread for everyone. He provides everyone a place to rest. They're all sitting in the grass and they're comfortable, but also he is the Son of God. He walks on water. Storms have nothing to say about him, can't do anything to him. He's just going to walk through it. And now, on top of all that, once he gets in the boat, they're instantly teleported to where they were going, right? A miracle that, you know, can't be explained other than he's God, right? And it's just like the only way it can be explained. And so that is John chapter 6. That is the fourth and fifth sign talking about it together. And so it really is. It's interesting to look at John's narrative with this perspective. You know that he's trying to prove these two things to his reader, and he understands his reader is a Galilean Jew, is a Samaritan Jew, and so these stories they also come. They're based on stories in the Torah and in the first five books, and what they consider the Torah, the first five books. And so he's really appealing to them. He's like, look, Moses fed them with manna, but it wasn't that great. They had to work on it every day. You couldn't have any leftovers, and so on and so forth. And here's Jesus. He's feeding them bread and fish, and there's 12 baskets of bread left over because there's plenty and there's enough for all of us. There's enough for Israel. And their response, he's the prophet. He's the one that was promised to us by Adonai in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 18. And then on top of that, not only he doesn't need God, the Father, to split open the lake so he can walk through it and get to his fellow his disciples. He could just walk on it. And I should mention that Eisenberg, he saw this as a picture of Noah and the ark. That he's the ark when the storm was rising, the floods or waters were rising, and God was flooding the earth. The ark would have been that safe place, that the only safe place that could float on top of the water and protect those who were in it. And so I can see that too, some imagery there too. That's kind of his viewpoint there. The image is about the ark. I like to think of it in terms of comparing how Moses needed the Father to split the water so he can walk through it, but Jesus could just walk on it himself because he is God. All right, so I am going to call it a morning there. We, I think, have sufficiently covered this subject. And again, like I said, for apologies for last night. Just got busy, wasn't feeling well, and so didn't want to do the gaming stream. But hopefully tonight be better. We'll get that done. And also apologize earlier for technical difficulties. I'm thankful that you stuck with it and watched through. And a heads up, we plan an impromptu trip for the weekend, and so tomorrow there won't be any sessions, but I will be back on Monday. All right, thank you for watching, and God bless.